Welcome to the Explainer. Today, we're going to break down a really powerful new framework for understanding how complex systems, everything from life itself to our climate, actually work, and maybe more importantly, why they sometimes break down. So let's just jump right in with a puzzle that has bugged scientists for, well, forever, really. It's this mystery of emergence. How does simple parts, like a bunch of molecules or a group of birds, somehow organize themselves into these complex, self-sustaining wholes, like a living cell or a flock? How does order just appear out of chaos? Well, the paper we're digging into today puts forward this core idea to solve the puzzle, and it's a principle called constraint closure. The easiest way to think about it is as a kind of self-building system. So what in the world does that actually mean? Well, a system with constraint closure is one where the very rules that hold it together are constantly being rebuilt by the system itself. A great way to picture this is a whirlpool. The swirling motion of the water is what creates the whirlpool's shape, and that shape, in turn, constrains the water to keep on swirling. It's this incredibly powerful self-reinforcing loop. Okay, so here's how that loop works. Step 1, the system's structure, its rules or constraints, organizes what all its individual parts are doing. Step 2, all that organized activity is what actually generates and sustains the system as a whole. And then step 3, the system, just by existing, reinforces its own organizing rules, which closes the loop and lets it keep going. Now, here's where it gets really cool. This whole theory gives us what's basically a control panel, a set of 6 dials we can use to measure and understand pretty much any complex system you can think of. So let's break them down. All right, first up, dial 1. The paper calls it C, and it's all about participation. It's a measure of how many of a system's parts are actively chipping in to keep the whole thing running. So the technical term for this is closure density. A living cell, for example, has an incredibly high closure density. Almost every single molecule and process inside it is working to maintain the life of the cell. On the other hand, a cloud of gas has a super low C because the molecules are just kind of bouncing around at random. Okay, on to our second dial, D. This one measures how deeply all those participating parts depend on each other. See, it's not just about how many parts are playing the game, but how tightly they're all interlocked. This is called constraint dependence depth, and honestly, this is such a brilliant way to picture it. Think about the difference between, say, a simple pile of bricks that you can knock over easily, and a deeply interlocked, self-supporting arch, where every single piece holds the others in place. That's high D. Dial number 3, R, is all about alignment. How well are the different bits and pieces of the system working together, instead of just ignoring each other, or even worse, working against each other. The paper calls this resonance coherence. And it's just like an orchestra, right? When R is high, everyone's in sync, they're playing in harmony, and you get this beautiful, coherent piece of music. But if it's low, it's just noise. Every musician is playing a different tune. Coherence is absolutely key. Okay, now dial number 4, G, is absolutely crucial. This one measures whether the system's feedback loops are actually strong enough to keep themselves going, or if they're just kind of fizzling out over time. See, for a system to really, truly persist, its feedback gain has to be at least 1. If G is less than 1, the system just fizzles out. It dies. But if it's 1 or more, it sustains itself. So this is the big takeaway here. A gain of 1 or greater is the absolute threshold for emergence. That's the magic number. All right, our 5th dial, H, is all about the system's internal robustness. You can think of it as measuring how many backup plans the system has. So, H is what they call constraint path entropy. A system with a high H has a ton of different ways to get a job done. If one pathway gets blocked, no big deal. It just uses another one. This makes it really adaptable and hard to break. It's all about flexibility. Okay, so we've got all these dials. How do they actually work together? Well, by turning them up and down, we can basically create a map that lets us classify any system into different states, or what the paper calls regimes. So on one end of the spectrum, you've got a totally disorganized system where all the dials are turned way down. But on the other end, you get strong emergence. And that's what happens when those first 4 core dials, participation, interdependence, alignment, and reinforcement, all cross a critical threshold. It's like a phase transition, like water turning into ice. It's a fundamental change from just a collection of parts to a truly integrated, self-sustaining whole. This framework actually lays out 5 key states. You start with disorganized, right? Then you move to something called proto-closure, where these little local loops start to form, but they're not really connected yet. And then you hit strong emergence. But it doesn't stop there. From that point, a system can either be rigid, strong but brittle because it has low pathway diversity, or it can be adaptive, which is really the goal state, strongly emergent and robust thanks to a high H.
Okay, so why does any of this matter? What's the big deal? Well, it's because this control panel of ours applies to everything. It gives us this unified language to talk about and compare systems that seem totally different, from the tiniest cell to the entire planet.
Take biology. We can now define health as a state of robust, adaptive emergence, where all the dials are cranked up high. A disease like cancer can be seen as a breakdown in that global coherence, that R dial, where cells work for themselves but not for the good of the whole. And in our own minds, consciousness itself is this incredibly integrated state. But a condition like chronic rumination, you can actually frame that as a rigid system, highly coherent and self-sustaining, but with dangerously low pathway diversity, that H dial, trapping a person in this painful loop.
And this thinking, it maps directly onto what's happening in our environment. An ecosystem's resilience, that's all about its pathway diversity. In other words, its biodiversity. And a climate tipping point? Well, that's the exact moment a global system's self-maintaining loops can't hold anymore, when its own constraints fail under too much pressure. And that brings us to maybe the most powerful and honestly pretty sobering idea in this whole framework. Every single one of these emergent systems has its limits.
The paper uses this brilliant analogy for that limit, a closure envelope, just like the flight envelope for an airplane. You know how a plane can only fly safely within a certain range of speed, altitude, and stress? If you push it too far, the whole thing fails catastrophically. Well, it's the exact same for any complex system. It's only stable within a certain range of conditions. Push it past that boundary, and its whole self-maintaining structure just collapses. So by understanding these dials that govern our world, we can maybe shift from being just passive passengers to active pilots. This framework doesn't just explain how things work. It gives us a kind of blueprint to ask much better questions about how to sustain them. It's a map. And the final question it leaves us with is a profound one. Can we learn to read it in time?